On April 29, 1975, Operation Frequent Wind officially commenced. It was the final phase in the evacuation of American civilians and at-risk Vietnamese from Saigon, occurring just before the city fell to the North Vietnamese Army on April 30, 1975. This operation is considered to mark the end of the Vietnam War. How was that so? South Vietnam, officially known as the Republic of Vietnam, was a Southeast Asian country that existed from 1955 to 1975. During this period, it was aligned with the Western Bloc in the Cold War, following the division of Vietnam in 1954. Similarly, there was a city in South Vietnam now called Ho Chi Minh City, but it was commonly known as Saigon at that time. Nevertheless, Saigon was and remains the most populous city in Vietnam. However, Operation Frequent Wind took place in Saigon, South Vietnam. Since we all know it was the final phase in the evacuation of American civilians and at-risk Vietnamese from Saigon. So the planning for the evacuation of Americans and their South Vietnamese allies from South Vietnam started before April 1975. On April 9, 1975, President Gerald Ford met with the National Security Council, where Henry Kissinger informed him that up to 1.7 million people might need to be evacuated. This number included American citizens and their families, diplomats, the International Commission of Control and Supervision, ICCS, third country nationals working for the U.S. government, U.S. employees and their families, which were around 200,000 people, Vietnamese relatives of American citizens, senior Vietnamese government officials and their families, which are about 600,000 people in total, and former Vietnamese employees of the U.S. and their families. Despite intelligence officials like CIA Director William Colby being certain that the South Vietnamese government would collapse, the U.S. government underestimated how quickly the North Vietnamese Army would advance and how fast the South Vietnamese Army, ARVN, would fall during the 1975 spring offensive. Evacuation plans were standard for American embassies, and the plan for Saigon had been developed over several years. Initially, it was called Talon Vice, but later it was renamed as Frequent Wind after the original code name was compromised. By 1975, the Frequent Wind plan aimed to evacuate about 8,000 U.S. citizens and third country nationals, but it couldn't accurately estimate the number of South Vietnamese needing evacuation. There were approximately 17,000 at-risk Vietnamese on embassy rolls. With an average of 7 dependents per family, this meant around 119,000 people needed evacuation. Including other categories of Vietnamese, the total number quickly exceeded 200,000. However, the Frequent Wind plan outlined 4 possible evacuation options. Option 1, evacuation by commercial airlift from Tan Son Nhut and other South Vietnamese airports as required. Option 2, evacuation by military airlift from Tan Son Nhut and other South Vietnamese airports as required. Option 3, evacuation by sea lift from Saigon port. Option 4, evacuation by helicopter to U.S. Navy ships in the South China Sea. Before we dive into each option, let's first understand the preparations made for the mission. On April 1st, a control center was set up at the Defense Attaché Office, shortly known as Dow Compound in Saigon. It was staffed by personnel from the U.S. Army, Navy, Air Force, and Marine Corps, operating in shifts to manage the evacuation. By April 2nd, the center was running around the clock. At the same time, Plan Alamo was put into action to defend the DL compound and its annex. This plan aimed to secure the area as a temporary shelter for up to 1,500 evacuees for 5 days. By April 16th, preparations under Plan Alamo were completed. Supplies like water, food rations, fuel, and backup power were stockpiled. Sanitation facilities were set up, and the perimeter was fortified with barbed wire. On April 7th, Air America pilot Nikki A. Philippi and U.S. Marine Corps Lieutenant Robert Twigger surveyed 37 buildings in Saigon as potential landing zones for helicopters. They selected 13 suitable locations and prepared them by removing obstacles and marking them with H symbols for helicopter landings. President Ford addressed the American public on April 11th, promising to evacuate various Vietnamese civilians. The 9th Marine Amphibious Brigade, also known as 9th MAB, responsible for providing helicopters and security, sent a delegation to coordinate with Ambassador Graham Martin on April 12th. Martin emphasized the need for discretion in planning, insisting that there be no visible signs of abandonment by the United States. By late April, Air America helicopters were conducting multiple daily flights between Task Force 76 and the Dao compound, facilitating evacuation preparations while adhering to the Paris Peace Accords restriction of 50 U.S. military personnel in South Vietnam. The main evacuation points designated for Operation Frequent Wind were the Dao compound near Tan Son Nhut Airport for American and Vietnamese civilians, and the U.S. Embassy in Saigon for embassy personnel. Buses and drivers were stationed at various points across Saigon to follow designated evacuation routes named after Western trails, ensuring orderly movement to the Dao compound. Throughout these preparations, the U.S. government maintained its obligations under the Paris Peace Accords despite the North Vietnamese invasion, ensuring operations were conducted within agreed-upon limits. Now, let's discuss the Frequent Wind Plan, which set out 4 possible evacuation options. By late March, the U.S. Embassy started reducing the number of American citizens in Vietnam. They encouraged dependents and non-essential personnel to leave on commercial flights and Military Airlift Command aka MAC aircraft, like C-141, NAS, and C-5S, which were also bringing in emergency military supplies. During this period, 2 or 3 MAC aircraft arrived daily, evacuating civilians and Vietnamese orphans. On April 4th, tragedy struck when a C-5A aircraft, carrying 250 Vietnamese orphans and escorts, suffered explosive decompression and crash-landed near Vung Tau, resulting in 153 fatalities. Following the incident, the entire C-5 fleet was grounded, and the MAC airlift shifted to using C-141S and C-130S. Evacuees were required to have individual seats and seatbelts on these flights, initially limiting passenger capacity to 94 on a C-141 and 75 on a C-130. However, as the evacuation intensified, these restrictions were relaxed. Throughout April, efforts to evacuate Americans slowed due to delays in obtaining Vietnamese government papers for dependents. This bureaucratic hurdle often led to MAC aircraft departing empty. The situation improved on April 19th when a simplified process resolved the paperwork issues, significantly increasing the number of evacuees. The fall of Xuan Loc on April 21st and President Nguyen Van Thie's resignation the same day prompted more people to seek evacuation at the Dao compound, realizing South Vietnam's imminent collapse. By April 22nd, up to 20 flights of C-141A and C-130S were evacuating people daily from Tan Son Nhut to Clark Air Base in the Philippines. However, on April 23rd, President Ferdinand Marcos announced limits on Vietnamese evacuees in the Philippines, adding pressure on the MAC, which had to move evacuees further to Guam, Wake Island, and Yokota Air Base. President Thieu departed for Taiwan on April 25th, and the Federal Aviation Administration initially banned commercial flights into South Vietnam, effectively ending the commercial airlift from Tan Son Nhut. On April 27th, rocket attacks by the PAVN hit Saigon and Cholon for the first time since the ceasefire in 1973. Consequently, the use of less maneuverable C-141S for evacuation ceased, with the focus shifting entirely to the more agile C-130S, which could carry over 240 passengers per flight. Between April 18th and 24, with the imminent fall of Saigon approaching, the U.S. Navy organized Task Force 76 off Vung Tau. This task force included several groups: Task Group 76.4, Movement Transport Group Alpha, comprising ships like USS Okinawa and USS Vancouver; Task Group 76.5, Movement Transport Group Bravo, with vessels such as USS Dubuque and USS Durham; and Task Group 76.9, Movement Transport Group Charlie, including USS Anchorage and USS Denver. They were reinforced by USS Hancock and USS Midway, each carrying Marine and Air Force helicopters for evacuation operations. Amphibious ships like USS Mount Vernon and USS Barber County, alongside guided missile frigate USS Warden and 8 destroyers including USS Richard B. Anderson and USS Cochrane, provided naval support and defense. Meanwhile, Task Force 77's USS Enterprise and USS Coral Sea Carrier groups in the South China Sea ensured air cover, while Task Force 73 managed logistics. The Marine Evacuation Force, Task Group 79.1, 9th Marine Amphibious Brigade, comprised units like 2nd Battalion, 4th Marines and helicopter squadrons, HMH 462, HMH 463, and HMM 165 from Marine Aircraft Group 39. Additionally, a flotilla of military Sealift Command ships facilitated seaborne evacuations from Saigon port, including tugboats like Asiatic Stamina, and transport ships such as SS American Challenger and USNS Greenville Victory. Furthermore, on April 28th at 6:06 p.m., 3 A-37 Dragonfly planes, piloted by former South Vietnamese Air Force pilots who had joined the North Vietnamese forces after the fall of Da Nang, dropped bombs on Tan Son Nhut Air Base, destroying several aircraft. South Vietnamese F-5 fighters attempted to intercept but couldn't catch the A-37s. Meanwhile, C-130 transport planes leaving the base encountered anti-aircraft fire, and the airfield came under sporadic rocket and artillery attacks. Flights were briefly halted but resumed that evening. Major General Homer D. Smith informed the evacuation center that 60 C-130 flights were scheduled for April 29th to evacuate 10,000 people. At 03:30 a.m. on April 29th, a rocket from North Vietnamese forces struck Guard Post 1 at the Dao compound, killing Marine Corporals Charles McMahon and Darwin Judge, the final American casualties on Vietnamese soil. Shortly after, a C-130 aircraft was destroyed by a rocket while taxiing at Tan Son Nhut after delivering supplies and evacuating refugees. The crew escaped and left on another C-130. This incident marked the departure of the last U.S. Air Force fixed-wing aircraft from the base. The Dao compound was hit by numerous artillery rounds and rockets between 4:30 a.m. and 8 a.m. At dawn, South Vietnamese Air Force aircraft, including A-37S, F-5S, C-7S, C-119S, and C-130S, began leaving Tan Son Nhut for Thailand, while UH-1 helicopters searched for Task Force 76 ships. Some South Vietnamese aircraft stayed behind to engage North Vietnamese forces. An AC-119 gunship operated throughout the night, defending against the advancing North Vietnamese troops. At dawn, 2 A-1 Sky Raiders patrolled the perimeter until one was shot down, likely by an SA-7 missile. By 7 a.m., the AC-119 was firing at North Vietnamese forces when it was hit by an SA-7 missile and crashed. At the same time, on April 29th, General Smith recommended to Ambassador Martin that fixed-wing evacuation cease and the helicopter evacuation known as Operation Frequent Wind begin. Ambassador Martin initially disagreed and visited Tan Son Nhut to assess the situation himself. By 10 a.m., he agreed with Smith's assessment and recommended Option 4, the helicopter evacuation, to Washington. The order to commence Option 4 was given at 10:51 a.m., but due to command confusion, Brigadier General Carey did not receive the order until 12:15 p.m. However, around 8 a.m., Lieutenant General Min and his staff from the South Vietnamese Air Force arrived at the Dao compound seeking evacuation, signaling the collapse of South Vietnamese command and control. To prepare for the evacuation, the American Embassy in Saigon distributed a 15-page booklet named SAFE, which stood for Standard Instruction and Advice to Civilians in an Emergency. This booklet included a map of Saigon marking designated assembly areas where a helicopter will pick you up. Inside, there was an insert with instructions on the evacuational signal, which was to be broadcast on Armed Forces Radio. The temperature in Saigon is 105 degrees and rising, followed by the playing of the song, "I'm Dreaming of a White Christmas." This unique signal caused a surreal moment, described by witnesses like Frank Snepp as a bizarre, Kafkaesque time. Japanese journalists even had to learn the tune from someone else to recognize it. To mitigate potential disruptions from both the North Vietnamese aka PAVN and South Vietnamese forces aka ARVN, planners carefully coordinated flight altitudes, routes, and safety checkpoints. Inbound flights to Saigon were set at altitudes of 6,500 feet, and outbound flights from Saigon to Navy ships at 5,500 feet to avoid ground threats like anti-aircraft artillery and missiles. Quick response Sparrowhawks teams aboard CH-46 helicopters were ready to secure any downed aircraft in hostile territory, with AH-1J Sea Cobra helicopters providing cover and acting as forward air controllers. USS Enterprise and USS Coral Sea's air wings were on standby for close air support if needed, supplemented by continuous cover from USAF aircraft. Despite radar tracking near Bien Hoa Air Base, the evacuation proceeded without interference from PAVN forces, though weather conditions deteriorated throughout the operation, impacting visibility and flight safety. However, coordination with the Dao was crucial. Air America dedicated most of its resources, with 24 out of its 28 helicopters and 31 pilots stationed in Saigon. Operating under challenging conditions, they conducted rooftop rescues and transported evacuees to the Dow compound and TF-76 ships. Fuel supply issues arose when operations shifted to the Dow Annex tennis courts due to security concerns. Despite these challenges, Air America's helicopters continued their missions, evacuating over 1,000 individuals, including Vietnamese dignitaries and intelligence personnel, ensuring no one was left behind before their final flights out to TF-76 ships by nightfall. However, at 2:06 p.m., 2 helicopters landed carrying Carey and Colonel Alfred M. Gray, Jr. They saw enemy fire hitting Tan Son Nhut Airport as they arrived at the Dow compound. They quickly set up a command post. At 3:06 p.m., 12 more helicopters arrived with Marine forces to strengthen defenses. They faced gunfire, but no damage was done. More helicopters landed later, bringing in additional troops. Marine units were deployed around the Dow headquarters and annex, securing the area. Evacuations began at 3:40 p.m. and continued through the evening. Additional troops were sent to the embassy for support. By 7:30 p.m., defenses were consolidated around key points. Evacuations finished by 8:30 p.m., ground forces withdrew by 10:50 p.m., and communications were cut at 11:40 p.m. The last troops left by helicopter at 12:30 a.m. on April 30th, as planned explosions went off. Moreover, on April 25th, 40 Marines arrived at the Dow compound to support the 18 already guarding the embassy. More Marines came later, boosting the number to 175. By April 29th, the embassy was crowded, with 2,500 evacuees and thousands more outside. Marines cut down trees to make helicopter landing zones. Evacuations began with helicopters landing every 10 minutes. Despite challenges like pilot fatigue and darkness, the evacuation continued until all Americans were out. By April 30th, the last Marines left the rooftop of the embassy just before North Vietnamese tanks entered Saigon, marking the end of the Vietnam War. During the operation, many RVNAF helicopters flew to the fleet as South Vietnam fell. Some pilots were instructed to ditch their helicopters after dropping off passengers. One pilot hesitated, and his helicopter hit the USS Blue Ridge before crashing into the sea, causing damage. Several UH-1 Hueys and a CH-47 Chinook were pushed overboard from TF-76 ships to make space for more helicopters. Other pilots also ditched their helicopters near the ships, bailing out to be rescued. On USS Midway, Major Boang famously landed his Cessna 01 on the carrier's cleared deck, becoming the first RVNAF fixed-wing pilot to do so. Meanwhile, thousands of South Vietnamese fled towards TF-76 aboard various vessels, including junks and sampans. TF-76 eventually departed with Operation Frequent Wind evacuees and 44,000 seaborne evacuees, heading for reception centers in the Philippines and Guam by May 2nd. During the evacuation from Tan Son Nhut, over 50,000 people, including Vietnamese orphans, were flown out. Marine pilots flew over 1,000 hours, making 682 flights during Operation Frequent Wind. At the Dow compound, helicopters evacuated 395 Americans and over 4,400 Vietnamese and others. From the embassy, nearly 1,000 Americans and 1,100 Vietnamese and others were evacuated. Additional evacuees arrived on TF-76 ships with help from Air America and RVNAF aircraft. Despite the operation's success, it highlighted the costly and, ultimately, unsuccessful American involvement in Vietnam. President Ford praised the pilots, but acknowledged the evacuation marked a sad chapter in U.S. history, following Nixon's promise of peace with honor, turning into a humiliating defeat amid the Watergate-era crisis of confidence in the 1970s. The total damage in the large and complex frequent wind operation casualties were relatively low. The only U.S. military deaths occurred when Marine Corporals Charles McMahon and Darwin Judge were killed at the Dow compound, marking the final U.S. ground casualties of the Vietnam War. Additionally, a Marine AH-1J Sea Cobra helicopter ran out of fuel during its search for USS Okinawa and had to ditch at sea, with both crew members later rescued by USS Kirk. Another incident involved a CH-46F helicopter from USS Hancock, piloted by Captain William C. Neistol and First Lieutenant Michael J. Shea, which crashed into the sea on approach to the ship after a night rescue mission. While the enlisted crew survived, the pilots' bodies were not recovered, and the cause of the crash remains unknown. April 30th is a public holiday in Vietnam known as Reunification Day or Liberation Day. It marks the official reunification of Vietnam on July 2nd, 1976. Many people also celebrate International Workers' Day on May 1st by taking the day off work and attending public events. For many Vietnamese living abroad, the week of April 30th is called Black April. It's a time to remember and mourn the fall of Saigon in South Vietnam. So this is it, my folks. I hope you enjoyed watching today's video. Let us know what your thoughts are about this intense story in the comments. If you love war stories like these, make sure to subscribe to our channel and leave this video a like if you enjoyed it. Till then, take care of yourself. See you in our next video.